Retired or thinking about retirement? You've come to the right place. Welcome to the Retirement Cafe podcast. In each episode, we bring you an important conversation with insight, tips and knowledge, all designed to help you live a fulfilling and successful life in retirement. Here's your host, Chartered Financial Planner and accredited later life advisor, Justin King.
Hello and a very warm welcome to the Retirement Cafe podcast, brought to you by MFP Wealth Management. This week, I'm tackling the challenging topic of assessing mental capacity. As we age, there are a number of occasions where we may need to check whether someone has still got the mental capacity to make a decision, whether that be for legal reasons or for medical reasons. And needless to say, it's a highly emotive topic. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Tim Farmer, who's known in the industry as the guru of mental capacity. He's the author of The Grandpa on a Skateboard and, really chuffed that he's taken the time to chat to us. So welcome to the show, Tim, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much. Thanks for asking. It's a pleasure. Really looking forward to it.
So, Tim, I'm going to launch straight in. Well, tell me a little bit, tell our listeners, for those who may not know of you, a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, so I'm a multi-award-winning author and expert witness specialising in the assessment of mental capacity. I'm also the founder of a company called TSF, which is, again, a multi-award-winning company, and we specialise solely in the assessment of mental capacity. So my background is I'm a mental health nurse by trade. So I've had over about 25 years plus experience of working with people with reduced cognition and capacity. And it must be about 8 years ago, a solicitor approached me and said, look, do you know a doctor that can do a mental capacity assessment? And I said, well, actually, I train the doctors. I teach the doctors how to do it. Can I not do it? And he said, well, I don't know. We only ever use doctors. So I did the assessment. So I became the first nurse to have evidence accepted by the Court of Protection. And then I looked around at the provision of mental capacity assessments, and it struck me that I suppose the most worrying thing for me at the time was the average turnaround time was 4 months using the GP. The quality of the reports was very poor. So I said to myself, I've got to change it. So I kind of pulled up my underpants, put my cape on, and decided I'd start trying to change the world. And so I set up my company. We've now got 52 assessors across the UK, and I work alongside people such as Baroness Finlay. I regularly work with solicitors and financial advisors, and just trying to generally improve the quality and knowledge around mental capacity. Right.
And so could you give some examples of when someone might need a mental capacity test?
So we think that mental capacity is really another way of saying a person's ability to make a decision. So it's about when people are starting to struggle to make a decision, that's when you need to start thinking, right, I need to get their ability to make this decision assessed. And depending how complex the decision, I suppose depends how much more a person needs to understand. I remember when I first started, I got in touch with one of the court judges and said, look, who is it that can assess mental capacity? And he came back to me and said, well, anybody can assess mental capacity. So, and I suspect what I should have asked is, who should assess mental capacity? Right. And so on a day-to-day thing, let's say, the small decisions about, can this person go to the park? Do they want to have Weetabix for breakfast? I think anybody can assess the capacity around those. But as we get more and more complex, so it might be around what to do with their money or where to live, then I think that's when you need to start to get the specialists in. Yeah. And when I talk about a specialist, it's not necessarily the GP. It's not necessarily the consultant psychiatrist. I would say it's the person that's got the most experience and the most knowledge and can do the best job for you.
Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty huge thing, isn't it, to be able to turn around to something, in day-to-day life. I don't think anyone's ever assessed my mental capacity.
I'm doing it now.
To make financial decisions. And suddenly to someone to be maybe suggesting that should be done, or how does that kind of position, you may have bought a house or you may have made a financial transaction, and your lawyer or your solicitor probably didn't assess, well, they may have assessed your mental capacity or not been in doubt of it in the first place. So at what point do we cross over to that line?
Well, I think it's when people start to struggle to make decisions. And the Mental Capacity Act, so basically when we're assessing somebody's ability to make a decision, we're looking at four things. really. We're looking at their ability to understand relevant information. And it's really important that we think about the relevant information.
Right.
It's about a person's ability to retain that relevant information. And when we think about retaining it, they have to be able to retain it for the length of the decision-making process. A person then also has to be able to kind of weigh up, use and apply that information, and then they have to communicate it back. So if at any point somebody starts to struggle with one of those 4 areas, I think that's when we find we've crossed over that line, and we have to say, right, let's just take a break. Let's think about whether this person's able to make the decision for themselves. And if we're not sure, let's get them assessed. I think you're right. I think it can be quite a difficult thing to present to people, and it'd be quite a difficult thing for people to hear.
Yeah.
And I always advise people to couch it in a way of, you're trying to do something in the client's or your mum or your dad's or your son's, your daughter, in their best interest, in that you are trying to make sure that if they're vulnerable, we're protecting them, and that their wishes are being met and being protected. I think when we talk about mental capacity, people often think of it as a negative thing, and if you like, a life sentence, to say, right, you've now lost capacity and that's it. And that's not the case. So people can regain capacity. Quite often we find people that might have a urinary tract infection, for example, and they become very confused.
Yeah.
And during that confused state, they may not be able to remember that information. They may not be able to work with it. But actually, once they've come out the other side, they're back to normal and they're great. So mental capacity is very much time specific. Right. And it's about, at this particular time, is there something that's stopping you from being able to make these decisions? Yeah. And then if that resolves itself, then we can say, right, well, you've regained capacity and crack on.
Let's say a family member who is worried about, I don't know, mum or dad, and, they're thinking, well, I'm not sure that they're making these decisions, and they feel that they need to get them assessed. What do they do?
Well, they give us a call.
Right, okay.
Give TSF a call, and we can talk it through with you. I think when we think about kind of the next stages, the first thing you need to narrow down really is what's the specific decision that you're thinking about. And so, it might well be, look, can mum and dad manage their property and finance? So I would try and identify the areas that you think your mum and dad might struggle in. And then I'd give us a call, and we can talk it through with you, and we can help you unpick the different bits. It's often really useful to approach a solicitor. So there are lots of really good solicitors that are versed in quarter protection work. There are lots of great IFAs that are also kind of very much aware of these sorts of issues. So you can go to these professionals and you can take advice from them and say, look, these are my concerns. What becomes the next stage? And then, at TSF or the solicitor or the IFA that you're talking to can kind of help you unpick that and then point you in the direction of where to get the assessment.
And how does if you were putting me through an assessment, what would I have to do?
What would you have to do? So assessment.
Can I quickly learn some of these skills so that I'm ready for it?
We do have people trying to coach individuals.
I didn't pass my 11 plus, so I'm a bit worried.
Yeah. So an assessment is very much a chat.
Right.
So the way that we structure it, the way that I do it, is I sit down with an individual and I'll say, look, I've come to talk to you about how you manage your property and finance, for example. And so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about how you manage it at the moment, any of the issues you might struggle with. We'll talk about what money you've got, how you manage it, if anybody helps you. And it's very much just a very gentle chat. I believe very much that our job is to show the person at their best. And while we're doing that, and as we're doing that, it's also about highlighting little areas where they might struggle and exploring with them how we might support them or they might be supported to overcome it. Now, the Mental Capacity Act is really clear in that it says we can't expect everybody to know everything about everything.
No.
And so it's about what would the average man on the street need to understand about, say, managing their money. And the Act is also very clear that if there's something that they don't understand, my job as an assessor is to try and help them understand it. So, for example, if they don't know how much money they've got, then I can say, well, actually, look, let's have a look at your bank account, and this is what you've got. And let's try and work with that. And then it would be about seeing if they could remember that information later on to be able to make a decision.
And once an assessment's taken place,
Yep.
What happens to those results? I mean, are they shared? Does everyone know about them?
So everything is confidential, and if we only share our information with the person that's instructed us, and it really depends what you need from the assessment. So it might be that you've come to us and said, look, mum wants to make a lasting power of attorney. She's got early onset dementia, and we're a little bit worried about whether she's able to do it. So we would sit down and we would do that assessment, and then at the end of it, we'd be able to say, yeah, absolutely, she can do it. And in fact, we've signed it and we've been the certificate provider. Or we can say, we don't think your mum can do it, but what we can do is we can now do a report that you can present to the Court of Protection. It basically says, look, mum's not able to do it, so can you appoint us, you, the daughter, or whoever you want, to manage mum's finances for her.
Right, great. And I suppose the solicitors are doing that in the same vein. They're just trying to make sure that when they're taking an instruction that it's been, and I suppose I can imagine people changing their wills, for argument's sake, that could be a classic, couldn't it? All of a sudden, a will's been in place for a long time, and then all of a sudden it's for that someone wants to change it with a different beneficiary, unknown before, and wanting to check that that's the right thing.
Yeah, and I think for many cases there's also a belt and braces aspect to this. So if people are making kind of quite controversial decisions, like say someone might have decided that they don't want to include a certain beneficiary and they feel it might be challenged later, then they might say, well, I want a capacity assessment so that I can rebuff that challenge later. Or it might be that the person is struggling with memory or with understanding, and actually you want to make sure that what they're saying, they're really understanding the consequences of the decisions they're making.
I mean, I presume, to a certain extent, of course, your mental capacity assessment is a bit like any health assessment, I suppose, is a bit, it's fluid, isn't it? I mean, I'm at the moment hopefully fit and well talking to you, but who knows where I'll be tomorrow? And what happens in the 24 hours between now and then? It could change my capacity to make decisions, couldn't it?
It could. There are two very key elements to mental capacity. One is that it's item specific. And one is it's time specific. Right. And like you say, with the time, it's all we can really say is, what are you like now? So at the moment, look at you on the screen and say, yeah, absolutely, you've got capacity and blah, blah, blah. But after this, you might step outside, you get, God forbid, you get knocked down by a bus or something, and that could suddenly change everything. And so that's why we say that capacity is time specific. And as I mentioned earlier, you might become unwell. And during that period of being unwell, you might lose capacity. But then when you get better, you might come out the other side. The reason that capacity is item specific is because of this thing that we call the threshold of understanding. So what you would need to understand to make a will is very different to what you need to understand, to decide where to live. Or it is very different to decide what you might want for breakfast.
Yeah.
And so quite often we find that people are able to make decisions about lots of things, but there might just be one specific thing that they're not able to understand or retain the relevant information for. So it's that decision they lose the capacity for.
Yeah, and I understand. We've chatted to quite a few dementia experts on the podcast in previous episodes, and one thing that I found quite interesting is that there was a suggestion that dementia, some days are better than others. So there are days where it's not like you're just poorly. It's just some days that you've got lucidity and some days you haven't. And I suppose if you were assessing capacity, well, that must be quite challenging to a certain extent because of course what day do you get them to read the documents and understand it?
Yeah. So and that's part of kind of the pre-work, if you like,
right.
Before we go and do an assessment, is about finding out when people are better. Right. So we often know that people with dementia are better in the morning than in the afternoon.
Okay.
And it's about trying to make sure your assessment sees them in a place that they're familiar with and comfortable with, because we know if people are confused and you put them in an alien environment, it makes them more confused. It's about trying to find that right time for them. So one of the questions we will always ask when we see somebody is, actually, is today a good day? Because if it's not a good day, if it's not a good time to get them, then can we postpone that?
Yeah.
I think the other really important thing is about, because somebody's got a diagnosis of dementia, doesn't automatically mean they can't make a decision. And it's about, there's something called the causative nexus, which we look for, which is a link between any illness or impairment of the mind to their ability to understand and retain and weigh up and use information. Got a great story. I was asked to see an old lady. She was 89. She had early onset dementia, and she had £400,000 in the bank. She had no driving license, and she wanted to buy a £350,000 sports car.
Wow.
Now, instant. When you're presented with those facts, you think, okay, I think something might be a little awry here. But I went along to see her, and I said, tell me about what's going on. And she said, well, the thing is, I'm 89. I've got cancer. I've been told I've got 3 months left to live, but I've got an only child, and ever since he was about 7, he's wanted a particular type of sports car, and that sports car costs £350,000. Not buying the car for me, I'm buying it for him. And she was able to explain that, once she spent that money, she had £50,000 left, and if she'd if they got the diagnosis wrong, she lived for another 2 years, and she had plenty of money, and if after that she was still alive, well, she'd be in a care home and the state would look after her. Right. Okay. So even though she had this dementia, she was actually perfectly capable of being able to make these decisions and buy this sports car, which she did. And her son was over the moon about, as you can imagine.
Amazing.
Yeah. So I think it's really important that we see the individual rather than a diagnosis or an impairment and that sort of thing.
Wise words. So tell me about your book, Grandpa on a Skateboard. This is the practicalities of assessing mental capacity and unwise decisions. So why did you decide to write this? This is
Well, I read it several years ago because at the time there were loads of really heavy textbooks talking about mental capacity, right, but there was nothing that said, look, this is how you do it in practice. This is and the intention of the book is it's an easy read that basically says, look, this is what you need to understand, and this is how you do it, and it's a pick up and put down, and there's no jargon, and it's if you like a dummy's guide to assessing capacity. Right. And I got the idea of the title. There's a guy on Google, you can Google him. There's a guy called John Joe. He's in Spain. At the age of 74, he took up skateboarding. Right. Because it's so much like his other hobby, which is snowboarding. Okay. And you can see him being interviewed, and the lady interviewing says, but John Joe, aren't you worried about hurting yourself? He says, well, of course I am, but that's why I go slowly. and it just struck me as such a perfect example of what we would call an unwise decision. I suppose an unwise decision is a decision that somebody else would make that's different to you, but is based on the same body of evidence. And they've got to be two things present. They've got to understand the risks associated with that decision. And they've got to understand, and they've got to be able to demonstrate logical steps that gets them from that body of evidence to the outcome. And if both those things are in place, then we say it's an unwise decision. Right. And it just, John Joe on the skateboard just struck me as a perfect example.
Yeah. So this is really aimed at people who maybe have a loved one who they're slightly kind of going, I'm not sure what's going on, and I want to become more educated in this idea about, how can I make sure that mum has got the mental capacity to make these decisions before probably bringing in an expert like yourself or a GP? Or
I think so, yeah. I mean, I originally wrote it for kind of the lay person, right. But I've since had barristers and solicitors and IFAs come up and go, oh yeah, I love your book, and I give it to all my clients, and I've made sure everybody in the office has read it. Well,
we're all these professionals, I'm sure, like myself, are trying to do a great job for people, and suddenly you're faced with a scenario like that, and you're thinking, well, why have I got the skills to make an assessment? Why would I know? And therefore we need to refer to an expert, obviously like yourselves, or as I say, I appreciate the GPs still can do the assessments as well, but they're under more and more pressure as well.
They can, and there are some very, very good GPs out there that can do it. And there are other GPs, and we're starting to increasingly find this, that are backing away and saying, I don't have the time, I don't have the skills, I don't have the expertise. And so, we're finding that the individuals are starting to need to go elsewhere. And I suppose that's where we come in. We are the experts in the field.
So where can, it's been fascinating talking to you. It's an area that I really, knew a little about. So I feel a little bit more informed now, which is the idea of the podcast. But where can people find out more about you?
So if you can go online, and if you Google TSF Consultants, so that Tango Sierra Foxtrot Consultants, right. That's the company. If you put in Tim Farmer mental capacity, I'll pop up and you'll see my big smiling face. If you want to get a copy of my book, you can get it on Amazon.
Great.
if you want to give us a call, our telephone number is 0333, so 0333 577 7020. It's one of these free phone numbers from your landline and mobile.
Right. Wonderful. Well, we'll put all those links in the show notes so that people don't have to, if they're listening in their car or walking about, they don't have to get out a pad of paper. But thank you so much for joining me today. It's been really, really fascinating, and doing great work.
Thank you.
So if you'd like to find out more about Tim and the work he does and his book, please check out the show notes at theretirementcafe.co.uk, where you'll find all those useful links. And to continue the conversation about topics we've discussed on the podcast, or to stay up to date with posts and articles relevant to your retirement, then please visit and follow our page on Facebook. Simply search for theretirementcafe.co.uk. So as always, if you've enjoyed this episode, please do leave a review on iTunes or subscribe so you'll never miss an episode, either on our website or your preferred podcast player. Finally, thank you to MFP Wealth Management for sponsoring the Retirement Cafe podcast and making it all possible. Until next time, this is Justin King, helping you feel more informed in your retirement.
Thank you for listening to the Retirement Cafe podcast with Justin King. To find out more, you can find us online at theretirementcafe.co.uk.